The room went silent when the maid dropped to her knees, her hands trembling as she begged for a single plate of food. Around her, wealthy guests in expensive gowns and tailored suits watched without moving, while the woman who had ordered the humiliation stood proudly beside the banquet table. But none of them knew that the billionaire of the house was only seconds away from walking through those doors. And when he finally did, what he saw would change everything. If you believe kindness should never depend on someone's wealth, status, or appearance, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes, the person everyone ignores is the one whose story deserves to be heard the most. The mansion stood on a quiet hill outside Greenwich, Connecticut, overlooking acres of perfectly trimmed gardens and a private lake that reflected the golden lights of the estate. That evening, the house was glowing with chandeliers, flowers, crystal glasses, and hundreds of candles. It was the engagement celebration of billionaire businessman Nathaniel Carter and his fiancée, Victoria Harrington. Guests had traveled from New York, Boston, and Washington to attend the extravagant event. Among them were politicians, investors, celebrities, and powerful business executives. Everyone seemed to belong in that world except one young woman named Hannah Brooks, a 26-year-old maid who had worked at the Carter estate for almost 2 years. Hannah had never complained about the long hours. She had grown up in a small town in Pennsylvania, raised by a widowed mother who taught her that honest work was never something to be ashamed of. After her mother became ill, Hannah moved to Connecticut and took whatever work she could find. She sent most of her earnings home to help pay for her mother's treatment. She dreamed of becoming a nurse one day, but for now, carrying trays and cleaning rooms was how she survived. She was quiet, respectful, and almost invisible to the wealthy people who passed her every day. Victoria, however, noticed Hannah. From the beginning, Victoria had disliked the young maid. Hannah never tried to flatter her, never praised her expensive jewelry, and never seemed impressed by the designer dresses she wore. Victoria interpreted Hannah's quietness as disrespect. Worse, Nathaniel occasionally treated Hannah with simple human kindness, asking whether the staff had eaten or whether they needed anything before working late. To Hannah, those gestures meant nothing more than decency. To Victoria, they became another reason to resent her. That night, Victoria wore a shimmering emerald gown and stood at the center of the ballroom while guests admired the enormous diamond on her finger. Nathaniel had not yet returned from a business meeting in Manhattan. His private jet had been delayed, and he had promised to arrive before dinner. Victoria was determined to make the celebration perfect before he came home. During the dinner service, Hannah carried a tray of appetizers toward the guests. She had been working since early morning and had barely eaten anything. When she passed the dining area, the smell of roasted chicken, warm bread, and creamy potatoes made her stomach ache. She had quietly asked another maid, Grace Mitchell, if she could save a small plate for later. Victoria overheard her. Instead of ignoring it, Victoria turned toward Hannah in front of several guests and coldly asked whether she was planning to eat the food prepared for the guests. Hannah immediately apologized and explained that she had been working all day and only wanted something small after the service. Victoria's expression hardened. She told Hannah that the food belonged to invited guests and that servants were not supposed to help themselves. Hannah lowered her eyes and apologized again. But Victoria was not finished. With dozens of people watching, she ordered Hannah to kneel beside the dining table and beg for whatever food the guests were willing to give her. The room became uncomfortable, but nobody challenged Victoria. Some guests looked away. Others whispered behind their hands. One woman even laughed nervously, as if the humiliation were some strange entertainment. Hannah stood frozen for several seconds. Her face burned with embarrassment. She thought about walking away, but she knew she could lose her job. Her mother depended on the money she sent home every week. So, swallowing her pride, Hannah slowly lowered herself to her knees. She clasped her hands together and quietly begged for a piece of bread. The sight broke Grace's heart, but Victoria simply smiled. She picked up a small piece of bread from the table and held it just beyond Hannah's reach. She told her to ask properly. Hannah's eyes filled with tears as she repeated her request. The guests remained silent. Then Victoria dropped the bread onto the marble floor. Hannah stared at it. For a moment, she could not move. She had spent her entire life struggling, but she had never imagined she would be forced to beg for food while surrounded by people eating from silver plates. Her hands shook as she reached toward the floor. And just as her fingers were about to touch the bread, the enormous ballroom doors opened. Nathaniel Carter walked in. He was still wearing the dark suit he had traveled in, his expression tired from the long day. But the exhaustion disappeared from his face the instant he saw Hannah kneeling on the floor. He looked at the bread. Then at Hannah. Then at Victoria. Nobody spoke. Nathaniel slowly walked forward, and every step echoed through the ballroom. He stopped beside Hannah and crouched down. Instead of looking at her with disappointment, he gently picked up the bread himself and placed it on a nearby plate. Then he helped Hannah stand. Hannah could barely meet his eyes. Nathaniel asked what had happened, but before anyone could answer, Victoria quickly tried to explain that Hannah had stolen food and that she had merely been teaching the maid a lesson. Several guests nodded awkwardly, clearly unwilling to become involved. But Nathaniel did not believe her. He turned to the staff and asked whether Hannah had stolen anything. Nobody answered. Then Grace stepped forward, tears in her eyes, and told him the truth. She explained that Hannah had worked since dawn, had asked permission to eat later, and had been ordered to beg for food as punishment. Nathaniel's face became completely still. He looked around the room at the wealthy guests who had witnessed everything and done nothing. Then he looked at Victoria, the woman he had planned to marry. He asked her one simple question: how could she humiliate someone who was simply hungry? Victoria became defensive. She argued that she was protecting the reputation of the Carter family and that servants needed to understand their place. She reminded Nathaniel that they were surrounded by important people and that Hannah had embarrassed the household. Nathaniel shook his head. He told Victoria that Hannah had not embarrassed the Carter family. Victoria had. Then Nathaniel did something nobody expected. He walked to the dining table, picked up a fresh plate filled with food, and handed it to Hannah. He told her she never needed permission to eat in his house. If someone worked all day to serve others, that person deserved to sit down and eat with dignity. Hannah began crying. She tried to thank him, but Nathaniel stopped her and said she had nothing to thank him for. Basic kindness should never be treated like a gift. Then Nathaniel turned toward the entire room. He revealed that he had been reviewing the household accounts for months and had discovered that several staff members were regularly working unpaid overtime. He had also learned that some employees had been afraid to complain because Victoria had threatened to replace them. Victoria went pale. Nathaniel had trusted her with his home, but he now realized she had used that trust to control people who could not defend themselves. He removed the engagement ring from Victoria's hand and told her the wedding was cancelled. The ballroom erupted into whispers. Victoria begged him to reconsider, insisting that she loved him and that one mistake should not destroy their future. Nathaniel replied that the problem was not one mistake. It was the belief that money gave someone the right to take away another person's dignity. Victoria left the mansion that night in tears. But the story did not end with her departure. Nathaniel called every employee together the following morning. He apologized for failing to see what had been happening under his own roof. He raised wages, paid the unpaid overtime, created a staff support fund, and offered Hannah a scholarship to attend nursing school. Hannah initially refused, saying she did not want charity. Nathaniel smiled and told her it was not charity. It was an opportunity she had earned through years of hard work and sacrifice. Months later, Hannah entered nursing school. She still visited her mother every weekend, but now she no longer had to choose between tuition and medicine. Grace became one of her closest friends, and the mansion became a workplace where every employee was treated with respect. Nathaniel also changed. The experience taught him that wealth could build enormous houses, but it could not create character. He began supporting local shelters and food programs across Connecticut, remembering the night when a hungry maid had been forced to beg for something that should have been freely given. 1 year later, Hannah graduated near the top of her class. During the ceremony, Nathaniel sat quietly among the crowd. When Hannah received her nursing certificate, she looked into the audience and saw him standing and applauding. She smiled through tears. The woman who had once begged for a piece of bread was now helping people who were sick, frightened, and forgotten. And perhaps that was the greatest revenge of all, not becoming rich, not humiliating Victoria in return, but becoming exactly the kind of person Hannah had always wanted to be. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who believes that kindness matters, and subscribe for more emotional stories that remind us that every human being deserves dignity. Before the story ends, comment, "Kindness has no price," if you believe nobody should ever be humiliated because they have less money or lower status. Because sometimes, the person kneeling before you today may be the person standing beside you tomorrow, and the way you treat them will reveal far more about your character than all the wealth in the world.